Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our monthly Computational Social Science webinar, organized by the Computational Social Science Lab at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. I'm highly associate professor of communication and also the associate director of the lab. So today we are very delighted to have Professor Sandra González-Bailón. So let me briefly introduce Professor González-Bailón. She is Carolyn Marvin Professor of Communication at the Annenberg School, University of Pennsylvania, and also is director of the Center for Information Networks and Democracy. She's a leading scholar of computational social science and political communication. Her research looks at how online networks and algorithmic curation shape information exposure with implications for how we think about political engagement, mobilization, information diffusion, and also news consumption. She has published many influential articles in top journals like Science and Nature. So we are very privileged to have her here today to share one of her recent studies on algorithmic curation using a large-scale data set from Facebook. So without further ado, so please join me in welcoming Professor González-Bailón. So during the talk, please feel free to post your questions in the chat box and chat box because later we'll have a Q&A session. So Sandra, take your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, and thank you for the invitation to join you. I'm very happy to be here virtually, finally, having postponed last time. And my plan for this talk is to discuss algorithmic curation, as Hai has said, and the role that it plays in exposure to political information. The big picture motivating this research relates to the role that information plays in democracies and to the fact that the quality of our democracies relies on the quality of the information that we consume. There is a lot of talk these days, as I'm sure you know, about how digital technologies are challenging the foundations of our democracies. And the truth is that communication technologies have always challenged our normative expectations of the role that information should play in a democracy. Communication technologies have long provided a broadcasting platform to propaganda efforts. They have allowed the substitution of high-quality news with low-quality content. And in general, they have helped instill priorities in the mind of the public that do not always align with what's of public interest. And so this has always been an issue. What's new and what digital technologies have done, and social media in particular, is that they have created a new category of challenges. One prominent challenge is that social media have eroded one of the most important mechanisms through which traditional news media enforce political accountability by blurring the boundaries between legitimate and illegitimate information and between credible and unreliable sources. These on the screen are some of the many research articles that have tried to characterize in recent years the sorts of information disorders that are challenging the democratic process, including the spread of rumors or the spread of misinformation, and that have tried to provide solutions and suggestions on how to address this problem. The problem of misinformation, of course, has two elements to it. One element, which refers to the supply of information, is about prevalence, so how common misinformation is. And in order to understand this element, we need to adopt sort of the bird's eye view and analyze on the aggregate how much misinformation there is out there. The other element refers to the demand side of the equation, and it is about exposure and susceptibility. In other words, it is about who is more likely to consume misinformation and to engage with it. And this requires a focus on the individual and their characteristics, including demographics or psychological propensities. Now, these are a couple of examples of research that has tried to assess one side of this equation, right? The prevalence of misinformation on social media. So for instance, the network figure comes from Greenberg et al., and it measures co-exposure to news on Twitter. And so in this particular visualization, each node represents a political news site, and the color, in particular orange, encodes fake news. And so essentially what the analysis of this co-exposure network revealed is that fake news sources have a niche interest. Users exposed to this type of content, which is a small fraction of all news content that circulates on the platform, users who engaged with that content were a minority of heavily overlapping individuals. And so, in other words, when we look at the prevalence of news and false stories, we can identify patterns like this. That is, we can identify pockets of unreliable news sources, and also who is more likely to gravitate towards those sources at the population level. And then there's the question of susceptibility and exposure, and of the demographic correlates that explain who is more likely to engage with political news or political misinformation, and the types of behavioral interventions that are more likely to be successful in discouraging engagement with false news. And again, supply and demand are in constant interaction, right? You cannot understand one without understanding the other, even if often, for convenience, we break the feedback loop apart to be able to run our experiments or to be able to design our research in a way that makes it feasible. And yet this constant interaction between supply and demand is not the only feedback loop that is beating at the heart of the information ecosystem. There is another loop matching individuals to content, and that is the curation loop, right? The process by which individuals are presented with a subset of all the information that they could see, and a process that learns from how individuals engage with that information so that in the next iteration, it incorporates that knowledge into making new recommendations and new selections. And this is a process in which both social choices and algorithmic systems play a role. Social and algorithmic forms of curation allow us to select into information and also organize that information. And what matters is that this process often results in different information realities for different people. And so the research that I want to discuss today was designed to measure the outcomes, the consequences of this feedback loop that is part algorithmic and part social, and to measure those outcomes on the aggregate at the level of the information ecosystem. Now, why is it important that we focus on the aggregate outcomes on the systemic level? Well, I haven't really found a better answer to that question than what Schelling emphasized many, many years ago already in his book, Micro Motives and Macro Behavior, which is a book that I was obsessed with as a grad student. And the reason, according to him, is that if we only pay attention to individual motivations or to revealed preferences, we are unlikely to see or understand the aggregated consequences of their behavior and their interactions, consequences that may not be aligned with or explainable by their original intentions. And so what you have on the screen here is Schelling's classic model of racial segregation. He showed basically two things with this very simple model. First, he showed that aggregated patterns often arise as an unintended consequence of individual behaviors, which means that if we were to take a snapshot of the aggregated patterns that results from individual interactions, we would probably draw the wrong conclusions about the underlying individual level mechanisms. And the second thing that he showed is that small differences at the individual level can make big differences on the aggregate, and in a way that we wouldn't be able to anticipate just by looking at the individual parts. And so this is a lesson that I learned a long time ago, and that guided much of my own thinking as I was developing my understanding of how to best analyze the social world and the information environments that we create. And so as long as actors are interdependent and connected in a system driven by feedback loops, you need to analyze the collective dynamics that emerge on the aggregate to fully understand the system. Just looking at individual behaviors is not enough. And so this is exactly what we do in this paper that I want to discuss today. We look at the system and at the feedback loops that drive the behavior of that system. this is the paper that I will discuss in more detail. It went with the title Asymmetric Ideological Segregation in Exposure to Political News on Facebook. And in this paper, we talk about a different type of segregation than the one Schelling considered, but it echoes the same spirit, right? And I'll tell you why in a second. As a preamble, let me just say that this paper was published last July as part of the initial package of articles that came out of the US 2020 Facebook and Instagram election study. The other 3 papers in this initial package are experimental. This is the only study in this group that is purely observational. And in this research, we analyze essentially information exposure for the 208 million US Facebook users that were active during our observation period, which goes from September of 2020 to February of 2021. And so this is part of a larger collaboration that I suspect you've heard about. So I won't tell you too much more about it. There's some background information on the web. But what I want to do is emphasize how long it took us to complete this project, or at least the initial set of papers that have already been published. The project is ongoing. We started the research in early 2020, partly as a continuation of an initiative that some of you may have also heard about, Social Science One, which is a project that was created to facilitate industry, academia collaboration to study the impact of social media on society, and specifically to make data available to researchers who do not work for social media companies. Now, out of Social Science One grew the project that I want to discuss today, which consists on 16 different studies that we pre-registered in October of 2020. I'm not sure whether pre-registration is standard across fields, and I know that there's a range of fields represented in the audience. And so essentially, for those of you who are not familiar with it, pre-registration is the practice of documenting your research plan at the beginning of the study and storing that plan in a repository, in our case, the Open Science Framework Registry. And so this is a key part of efforts to promote and encourage transparency in research. And in the context of this project, it was also a way of ensuring a contractual obligation of sorts between us and Meta in this case, right? So we pre-registered the studies partly to make sure that we had a document with a set of requisites, data requisites that were needed in order for us to be able to complete the projects and answer the research questions that we pre-registered. Some of the studies that were pre-registered are observational, some are experimental, some focus on the analysis of on-platform exposure to information, some also consider off-platform effects. The paper that I will discuss today is one of the observational projects that centers on platform exposure, and that specifically considers this question of algorithmic curation versus social curation and selection. All right, so our main goal when designing this project was to be able to answer this one question: do conservatives and liberals consume different news on the platform? This question echoes the concern that a widening gap in the political information that conservatives and liberals consume can exacerbate the political frictions that already exist in US society. And so if algorithmic systems are contributing to amplify the gap, we should know. And so in our pre-analysis plan, we pre-registered more specific questions around the existence of segregation in news consumption. And so we had 4 areas of specific interest. The first is the role that algorithmic curation played in shaping exposure to specific types of news. We also wanted to see if levels of segregation varied during the course of the election. A third important element of how we were thinking about the data was to be able to separate exposure to news stories from exposure to news sources. And the logic behind this is that if we think of news consumption as a diet, this diet online resembles more a buffet-style eating than a set menu kind of eating, right? And what I mean by this is that on social media, news sources, the branding often becomes less relevant than the specific news stories that we see and interact with in those networks, right? So we wanted to separate exposure to a particular source with a particular branding recognition, like say the New York Times, from exposure to specific stories within that source. And then the fourth thing that we were also interested in is measuring segregation in exposure to unreliable content and assessing whether unreliable content was more likely to be seen by conservatives or liberals. In order to answer these questions, we used three measures. First, we use the segregation index, which is a metric that has been used before in the study of online news exposure, and that is adapted from research on residential segregation. So again, a connection here to Schelling in a way. And the idea here is to be able to determine if Facebook's news ecosystem reveals patterns of ideological segregation, like cities reveal patterns of residential segregation, right? So following this past work, we use the isolation index, which captures whether conservatives disproportionately see news domains or news stories that have mostly conservative audiences. And so the first summation is the visit-weighted average exposure of conservatives to conservatives across all news domains or news stories. And the second summation is the visit-weighted average exposure of liberal to conservatives. And so the index ranges from 0 to 1. It is 0 if there is no segregation in news exposure, and it is 1 if conservatives only see domains or stories with audiences that are 100% conservatives, and vice versa, if liberals only see domains or stories that are 100% liberal. Now, of course, the question is, where does news exposure on Facebook fall in between these two extremes of no segregation to full segregation, right? Then we also looked at the news sources and the news stories circulating on the platform, and we measured how homogeneous their audiences are in ideological terms. And so here we use another score. This score equals 1 when a given domain or URL has an audience formed exclusively by conservatives, and -1 when it has an audience formed exclusively by liberals. And so if the segregation index offers a summary statistic of the whole information ecosystem, these scores, which we call favorability scores, allow us to analyze the distribution of domains or URLs as they fall in this continuum of liberal-leaning or conservative-leaning audiences. And then the third thing we did is analyze co-exposure patterns. And what this means is that we look at how many of the users who were exposed to, say, the New York Times were also exposed to, say, the Washington Post. And the analysis of this network allows us to identify clusters or pockets of news sources around which audiences congregated on the platform. And so another way to think about these three measures is as operating at different levels of aggregation, right? So the segregation index is a summary statistic that helps us characterize the whole information ecosystem. The favorability scores are applied to specific domains or specific URLs, and they allow us to measure their audience ideological composition. So whether the audience of a specific news domain or a specific news story leans conservative or liberal. And then in between these two levels, we have the co-exposure networks, which operate at the mesoscale. So between the level of information ecosystems and the level of individual domains and stories. And at this mesoscale, we can see clustering that we wouldn't be able to see just by looking at the other two levels. All right, so now that I have defined the main metrics, let me tell you a little bit more about the main levels of analysis. So one of the main contributions of this work is that we track segregation levels down what we call the funnel of engagement. And so we have data on the inventory of content that users could potentially see on the platform. And one thing to note here that is very important is that this inventory changes from user to user depending on their network on the platform. So depending on who they follow, which groups they join, etc. And then we have data on the content that users actually saw on their feeds, right? And so after the process of algorithmic curation. And note here that what users see on their newsfeed is not only a function of algorithmic curation, right? There's also other factors like the time they spend on the platform or the speed with which they scroll down their feeds. But nonetheless, algorithmic curation plays an important role in determining what people see out of everything that they could potentially see, given their inventory. And then we have data on the content with which users decided to engage. And this is a subset of the information that they saw, the information that was presented in their newsfeed. And so what we do is measure segregation at each of these three levels of analysis, right? The level of potential exposure, which is the level of inventory, the level of actual exposure, which is what's presented in the newsfeed, and at the level of engagement, which is the subset of all the content with which users decided to engage. Another set of analysis disaggregates content as a function of who posted that content. And essentially, we have three different layers here, right? We have content posted by users. We have content posted by pages, which is a broadcasting surface within the platform. And then we have content posted by groups. And so the question is, do segregation levels vary depending on whether the content was posted by users or pages or groups? And do we find similar changes as we move down the funnel of engagement for each of these three different types of content? And finally, we also look at whether segregation levels vary for untrustworthy or false content. And I'm going to tell you in a second how we identify this content. But so we wanted to compare content that hasn't been rated as untrustworthy with content that is rated as trustworthy and see if levels of segregation vary once we segment the data according to how trustworthy or untrustworthy the content is labeled to be. So those are the main levels of analysis. Now I'm going to tell you more detail a little about the data. So our main unit of analysis, as you can guess already by now, are political news domains and political news stories, or URLs. We do not have any individual level data. All the data that we analyze in this paper are aggregated at the domain or URL levels. But the activity that we analyze on the aggregate includes all users that were based in the US during the period of analysis. As another privacy measure, we only analyze URLs and domains that were posted more than 100 times. So that we can reverse engineer the identity of the posters. Our observation window goes from September 1, 2020 to February 1, 2021, as I think I already mentioned. We use Meta's civic and news classifiers to identify posts containing URLs that were identified as political and as news. We also use Meta's ideology classifier to determine the audience composition of news domains and news URLs. And for those of you interested, we have a very extensive appendix to the paper where we present some performance metrics for all these classifiers. And then we use, and this is perhaps the most important part of our analysis, Meta's third-party fact-checking program to identify news stories that are rated as false and untrustworthy. And so, instead of us deciding what's trustworthy and what's not, what's true and what's false, what we do is use the ratings at the URL level that come from a network of fact-checking organizations that includes Snopes, Reuters, The Washington Post, FactChecker, FactCheck.org, and PolitiFact. And so we use the ratings they offered at the URL level to identify misinformation. And then we use that to assign untrustworthy labels at the domain level, right? So to identify domains that repeatedly share misinformation. And in particular, we labeled a domain as untrustworthy if two or more of their political news stories were rated as false by Meta's independent fact checkers from the beginning of the misinformation repeat offender program, which started in August of 2018. Okay, so this is a visual summary of the data that I just described and of our levels of analysis. Again, our analysis centered on three different levels. We have data on exposure to domains, which allows us to calculate segregation metrics at the news source level. We also have data on URLs, which allows us to calculate segregation metrics at the news story level. And then we have data on the co-exposure networks where nodes are domains or news stories, and the edges encode the number of unique users that are exposed to a given pair. The analysis of co-exposure networks allows us to determine whether there is notable clustering in exposure to sources and within sources in exposure to stories. And so if you look at the schematic examples, In panel A, so panels A to C, here, for instance, we do not see strong evidence of clustering, but the networks in subpanels D and E do. And so these are hypothetical networks. Our analyses try to uncover whether there's similar clustering in the data that we analyze. In panel B, you have, again, the schematic representation of the funnel of engagement from potential exposure to actual exposure to engagement. The numbers indicate the level of analysis implied in our research questions, which are, our news inventories ideologically segregated. Does segregation increase after algorithmic curation? And does segregation increase based on what content users choose to engage with? And then in panel C and D, we have the number of news domains categorized as untrustworthy or trustworthy, and the number of news URLs that were rated false or not rated false by Meta's third-party fact checkers that are present in our data as daily counts. And so yellow in this visualization indicates the volume of news domains or news URLs that were rated untrustworthy or false. Blue indicates the volume of news domains or stories that were not rated untrustworthy or false. And the red dashed lines highlight November 2nd and January 6th, which are the dates of the election and the US Capitol riot, respectively. And note that the proportion of political news URLs that were rated false was overall so low that you can barely see it, right? On a given day, this proportion is about 3% for domains and 0.2% for URLs. Let me quickly mention here that the inventory with which we start the funnel of engagement is itself the result of another curation process, namely the formation of the underlying network that users built on the platform. This network itself is the reflection of users' pre-existing ties and interests, but also the result of algorithmic recommendations on whom to follow, as well as platform affordances like the existence of pages and groups. We do not have data on any of these. We only know what content is in the inventory for each user, and we know that that content derives from those networks, but we didn't get access to any of the network data. So here we look at two of our metrics. We look at the segregation index and at the audience polarization scores at the domain and URL levels. And so if you look at panel A, what we see here is that the segregation score is consistently higher at the URL level than at the domain level. And what this suggests is that there are information curation practices with news stories that get masked when aggregating the data at the domain level. And this is perhaps a technical kind of message. A lot of the research that has been done is in this domain, mine included, uses domain level data. And so what we are seeing here is that if we only analyze exposure to news sources, aggregating that exposure at the source level, we may be masking selection processes that happen at the story level. And what this means in practical terms is that some people may consume certain news within the New York Times, like liberals may consume some news within the New York Times, and conservatives may consume other types of news within the New York Times. And so we only look at exposure at the domain level, we miss that segregation within the source. Just to give you a benchmark to assess the magnitude of these scores, this is a figure that we show in the appendix to the paper in the supplementary materials. And here we compare the segregation scores for the same set of individuals for a subset of Facebook users who agreed to participate in the study, who also gave us access to web tracking data so we could calculate on-platform and off-platform segregation. And as you can see, segregation on Facebook was at least 3 times larger than segregation on the web for the same subset of individuals. So back to this figure, if you look at panels B and C, here we show that the segregation goes up as we move down the funnel of engagement. And what this suggests is that algorithmic and social amplification both contribute to segregation, right? In this figure, the difference between potential and engaged audiences is only visible at the domain level, but in the supplementary materials, we have additional figures that show that this also applies to the URL level once we disaggregate the data according to the identity of the source. So this is the figure that we show, or two of the figures that we show in the appendix. And so here, for instance, we show that the process of algorithmic curation operates differently for groups, but for users and pages, we see that as we move down the funnel of engagement, levels of segregation go up. And so one thing that we uncovered with this figure is that curation operates differently for groups. And we suspect that this has something to do with the sort of interventions that the platform engineered to curtail information dynamics that were originating in groups. We can't know for sure. But what is clear is that for users and for pages, as you move down the funnel of engagement, levels of segregation go up, which suggests that both algorithmic and social forms of curation are playing a role in pushing people into different types of information. Back to this figure again. Now we're going to look at the lower row. And so here we show the ideology scores, but in this case, instead of summing up everything at the level of the information ecosystem, we're looking at the distribution of these ideological scores at the source and the story levels. And again, remember that when these scores are close to -1, it means that the audience of a particular domain or story is more liberal. And when the score is closer to +1, the more homogeneously conservative the audience is. Now, if you look at panel D, we see that overall audiences that are consuming political news on Facebook have a right-leaning slant. All scores are above the 0 line. But if we look at panels E and F, we get more granular information about the actual distribution of these scores. Here we have the density plots. We see that the distribution is substantially skewed towards the right. And what this means is there are many more domains and many more news stories that are being favored by very conservative audiences. And the vertical black lines in this visualization mark the quantiles of the distributions. To give you a sense of what these domains are, in this figure, we visualize the variation of URL ideology scores within domains for the top 100 domains by views. And essentially, these figures suggest that there is some variation in the ideology scores at the news story level, but overall, most scores stay below or above the 0 line. There's a few domains that publish news stories with a wider appeal across left-right audiences, but most are pretty homogeneous. Crucially, there is a sizable group of domains which consistently show extreme conservative scores. In other words, the users who were exposed to news stories published within these domains are pretty homogeneously conservative. And this is the corner where, according to our results, most misinformation lies. This is what we show in this figure. In this figure, we show, we look at the audience composition of untrustworthy domains and false URLs, again, according to the ratings of third-party fact checkers. The density plots in the upper row in panels A and B show that most domains that are categorized as untrustworthy are favored by audiences that are predominantly conservative. About 76% of untrustworthy domains have audiences that are conservative on average. And what this means, they all have an ideology score above 0. And again, a domain, remember, is labeled as untrustworthy if 2 or more of the stories that they publish were rated as false. These density plots are even kind of more starkly skewed towards the right when we look at the news story level. Panel C and D show that 97% of URLs rated as false have audiences that are predominantly conservative on average. And this concentration of misleading content in the most conservative pocket of Facebook information environment can also be seen in the analysis of co-exposure networks. And so remember that in these networks, nodes are domains or URLs, and the ties encode the number of users that are co-exposed to a given pair. And again, remember that the reason why we analyze these networks is because they allow us to determine whether we observe evidence of segregation, even if we know nothing about the ideology of users, right? The presence of clusters in these networks is evidence of selective exposure, which in this case is shaped by users' social networks, but also newsfeed algorithms. And so to identify those clusters, we use a community detection approach to identify those groups. I'm happy to give more details in the Q&A. And so what we plot in this figure are the top 3 communities sized in terms of views for each weekly network. So we aggregate these co-exposure networks on a week-by-week basis during our observation window. We identify the clusters, and here we are plotting the top 3 communities by views. And essentially, each of these communities is formed by domains or by URLs that have a higher overlap of audiences internally than externally. And so once we had the communities identified, we calculated the mean ideology scores for each community. And so that's the average score for the domains and the URLs that are classified in the same community. And essentially what this revealed is that the clustering that was identified based only on co-exposure behavior maps onto the 2 sides of the ideological continuum. There is a clear cluster of domains and URLs that liberal users are co-exposed to. And then there's a cluster on the conservative side. And what we again see here is that, in fact, there is an asymmetry, right? There is a major asymmetry between the left and the right. News sources and stories consumed by conservative audiences depart more clearly from the zero line of cross-cutting exposure. And what this means is that their audiences are more homogeneously conservative and therefore more isolated in the information that they consume. And so these outlets on the right are the outlets that post a higher fraction of news stories rated false by Meta's third-party fact checkers. And we encoded these with the color in this figure. And what this means, again, is that conservative audiences are more exposed to unreliable news. All right, so we show that ideological segregation is high, and it increases as we shift from potential exposure to actual exposure to engagement. We also show that there is an asymmetry between conservative and liberal audiences, with a substantial corner of the news ecosystem consumed exclusively by conservatives. And we also show that most misinformation, as identified by Meta's third-party fact-checking program, exists within this homogeneously conservative corner, which has no equivalent on the liberal side. And so in general, we find that sources that are favored by conservative audiences were more prevalent on Facebook's news ecosystem than those favored by liberals. Now, what does it all mean? What does this all mean, and why should it matter? And so I want to go back to my initial statement of the importance of adopting the bird's eye view. If there is one thing that we show in this paper, is that misinformation is a problem that affects mostly a restricted group of people that are very homogeneous, but they are also outliers. And we also show that some of the affordances of the platform, in particular pages, give oxygen, or at least during the period that we consider, they gave oxygen to this type of content and much more visibility to sources that elsewhere, for instance, the web, are much more peripheral in terms of their ability to reach people. In other words, we find that curation algorithms complicate the loop that connects supply and demand and results in an asymmetrical information ecosystem where most of the misinformation thrives on one side of the ideological divide. And this is a property of the information ecosystem. It is not a property that we can uncover by looking at demographics or at other individual characteristics or psychological propensities. The information ecosystem is biased towards, in terms of the supply of content, towards one side of the ideological spectrum. All right, so what are the next steps? There are other projects in this collaboration that are ongoing. They are in the process of being published, and that I think will help us cast more light on the information ecosystem that Facebook created as a whole during the 2020 election. In this research that I just discussed, we pay attention to exposure and how we select the information that we decide to engage with. In the paper that we are currently working on, we shift attention to information diffusion and to how content posted on the platform was shared and reshared. And so here we model diffusion events as hierarchical networks. And through the analysis of these networks or diffusion trees, right, we reconstruct the diffusion pathways of all types of content, including misinformation. And I'm hoping that I can share the results of this study soon. In the meantime, let me just mention that all the replication materials for the studies that have already been published, including the study that I just discussed, are available as part of the social media archive at ICPSR, which is an international consortium of academic institutions that maintains a data archive. And so if you wanted to look at the data, run different analyses, that's a possibility. And I think I'm going to leave it here and open it up to questions. So I'll stop sharing. There you go.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the fantastic talk. So now is the question time. So if you have any in the audience, if you have any questions, you can just raise your hand or okay, Jacob.
Hi, Sandra. I was wondering what we're to make of the how the confidence intervals become smaller as you move away from the median. I mean, both on the left and the right side. I mean, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but it'd be interesting to look into how kind of how much ideological flexibility there is in the right versus the left. I mean, obviously, I think people in the middle going toward those more middling centered or those you identify as center media sources maybe are more, I don't know, like if you were to make a strong assertion about politics and be a little more skeptical about kind of a claim on one extreme or the other. But I'm curious if you just think about those confidence intervals in the statistical sense, or if there's something substantial we can read into them in terms of how, you know, broad-minded people are about information or stories that conflicts with their priors.
Mm-hmm. So, Jacob, are you referring to this one figure where I show the variation for the news, depending on the news sources?
Yeah.
So these aren't confidence intervals as much as a measure is the interquantile range that we are plotting there. It's the average values and the interquantile range. And what that means is that for every news domain, remember, this is hierarchical data, right? So for every news domain, we have a lot of URLs. So the New York Times published during this observation period hundreds of not thousands of news stories. And so each of those news stories is a unique URL in our data. And for each of those news stories, we have a measure of audience composition that tells us whether the audience consuming that particular news story lean conservative or lean liberal. And then we can aggregate all those story level measures to the domain, sort of, you know, all the news stories published by the New York Times, and that's how we calculate those interquantile ranges, right? And so the meaning of that figure, that we plotted that figure partly to get a more qualitative sense of, you know, in the top 100 domains, what's included, but also, you know, how much variation do we get depending on whether we focus on news stories or domain level analysis. And so for the most part, what that figure shows is that, yes, there's some variation, and that suggests selection, right? So imagine, again, I'm using the New York Times all the time as an example, but it could be any domain. The New York Times publishes reporting, also opinion pieces. And so, you know, you can imagine that conservatives are more likely to share opinion pieces that are aligned with their priors, and liberals are more likely to engage with stories that are confirming their priors. And so within the same news source, we have this kind of selection happening, which is, you know, which is why I claimed at the beginning that if you only analyze domain level data, you are masking those selection processes and those differences. And so there is some variation, but for the most part, it's not totally misleading to just use the average, right? For all the stories that the New York Times publishes, all the stories that Breitbart publishes, you know, one is liberal leaning, the other is conservative leaning, right? What we thought was very interesting was the cluster of news domains that are very concentrated on very homogeneously conservative audiences, right? And these are the domains where most of the misinformation lies. These domains make it to the top 100 in terms of views within Facebook. If you look at web tracking data, they are very peripheral. They wouldn't be seen by nearly a fraction of the people that get exposed to them within Facebook, right? So these are very extreme domains in terms of the audiences that consume them. And we don't analyze the content, but you can imagine the content, what kind of content they publish. and they gain a lot of traction within Facebook that they wouldn't get otherwise.
Thank you.
Okay,
Yes.
Eric?
First of all, just a really fascinating presentation. I think this work is not only fascinating and but also very important for shedding some light on a phenomenon that is shaping the way we all interact with each other and the way we interact with events around us, and therefore the way we respond to those in sort of shelling type arguments. So this is all new to me, so I'm just sort of digesting it. But so if I'll maybe just kind of toss out a couple of sort of half-baked questions, a few half-baked questions, and you can ignore them all or respond to bits. So one is the shelling. You know, I think the shelling is a great place to start, and I think as time goes on, it's sort of a half century and more since his work, I think we're increasingly all beginning to see the deep relevance of that work. And so I'm, you know, very happy to see you kind of set that as a kind of foundation. So in that regard, you know, if I understand this correctly, in a sense, these curation algorithms are a little bit like the rules, the behavioral rules, that small adjustments of which in the shelling model can have large consequences in terms of the outcomes. And so again, I may not have fully absorbed your lecture, but I'm thinking that the curation algorithms, in fact, are kind of at the, you know, they are the nuts and bolts of what's happening, right? It's where the programming is done. Kind of the zeros and ones are set, that are kind of boring in themselves or technical in themselves in some way, but also fascinating. But they're what's driving the outcome there. And so, are you looking to progress towards, for example, having something like a rating scheme? Maybe you've done it and I just missed it, of saying, here are examples of algorithms that tend to skew or tend to, you know, allow or promote or induce disinformation. Here are algorithms. In other words, have you got a kind of code? Might there be a code of conduct, or if not even a code of conduct, a set of observations about coding mechanisms in terms of these curation algorithms that do cause consequences, so that we can be, because I'm based in a policy school, so I'm interested in, well, how might we intervene in all this in ways that are consistent with democracy and in free speech, etc., yet at the same time might promote a kind of a healthier kind of aggregate conversation among members of society. And I'm sorry to make that kind of vague, but I'll just add one little thing, if I may, or two little things, and sorry to go on for so long. But one is the example of gerrymandering. You know, this idea in an election context. In California, there was a move, I think it was when Schwarzenegger was governor. He made a point of redesigning the rules by which boundaries, you know, electoral district boundaries were set, so that they were less subject to political intervention, you know, so that it would be that the electors choose the candidates rather than the other way around, right? And so it made a huge difference. So I see that as quite analogous to these kind of curation algorithm, that might there be some kinds of interventions like that. And then the last thing I would ask is the role of kind of technology, as you know, this, if we go back say, when I was a young faculty member, say when cable news was kind of a dominant sort of emerging sort of phenomenon, and there wasn't the same technology. I'm wondering if one had done, if someone had done a similar study to what you've done now, using today's technology, this social media, what results might have. There might be an interesting sort of historical work to look at, that this kind of technology tends to favor these kinds of outcomes. And it might also relate, or might be more conducive to different kinds of curation algorithms. And again, sorry to go on sort of blabbering sort of incoherently, but that gives you a...
Thank you. No, it was very coherent, and thank you very much for these questions. I think they are all connected. What's new today, I will start with the last one. What's new today in the current information environment is that it's very decentralized. The gatekeeping is a network thing, right? In the past, you had journalists, editors curating the content for you. And of course, if you were predisposed to certain policy positions or kind of political ideological values, you would have been more likely to consume certain sources than others. But there were drastically fewer sources you could use to stay updated on political and current events. And second, the gatekeeping process was concentrated in a few hands of professionals, gatekeeping was concentrated. Now it's decentralized and it's not even human in a way, right? Like, so the algorithms are playing this role of matching users to content, presuming that they understand what the users want based on their past behaviors, but also based on parameters that are kind of intended to optimize for certain things, engagement or the time you spend on the platform, right? And so you may spend more time on the platform, the worse, the more outrageous the information that circulates on that platform gets, because conflict breeds engagement or toxicity breeds engagement. And so I think that's one big difference, right? Like, so the information environment today is way more complex than it ever was both in terms of the size, but also in terms of how we find the information in that environment. And no one really is in charge to the extent that, you may be the engineer who contributes to designing these algorithms, but because of the complexity of the system, you don't know how those algorithms are going to interact with users' behaviors, and that's going to be different for every user. And so that's one thing. And of course, an avenue for intervention here is to understand the effect that these algorithmic systems have on information dynamics. And so, I just mentioned that some algorithms are optimizing for engagement. So what if we change that and we introduce a different parameter about the quality of the information and we optimize for that? Now, of course, the trade-off here is that, if that reduces the use of the platform, that goes against the business interest. I mean, no corporation wants to optimize anything that's going to result into users stopping using your service, right, or your platform. And so there are trade-offs that what's good, for democracy is not necessarily of interest to the users. And so, so there's a lot of trade-offs to be solved and be mindful of as we think about how we redesign curation algorithms, because I'm not sure that most users want to, to use the fast food example. Nobody wants to eat broccoli. Everybody wants to eat fast food, right? And so can you blame Facebook of that? I don't know. But there's a lot of research. It's a very active research domain, the sort of the question of how do we design algorithms to bridge communities that wouldn't talk to each other otherwise. There's a lot of research on bridging algorithms. What do they look like? We also need more research in terms of, is that actually conducive to better outcomes? Like, if you expose people to those who think very differently from them, are they going to, avoid all discussions of politics? Sort of, like it's not clear that building more bridges is always conducive to better outcomes, because humans are complex animals and we don't always react as academics think we will react to certain interventions. And so this is an area that requires more research, of course. But just to mention one last thing in terms of interventions, yes, Schelling showed that small changes potentially can produce big outcomes. one of the beautiful things of his very simple model is that the underlying topology for the interactions is this lattice grid, right? And so results change not only as a function of the parameters that determine the user's behavior in terms of where they want to live, that's also determined by the density of the population. So how big the lattice is via V, how many agents are populating this virtual model. In Facebook, the quintessential characteristic of Facebook as a social media platform is that the underlying topology is a social graph, right? Unlike TikTok and the second generation social media platforms, inventories on Facebook derive directly from networks that users build themselves that reflect their sociological realities, their interests. Every user has a different network. Therefore, every user has a different inventory on which the algorithm is going to operate. On platforms like TikTok, there's the same inventory for everybody, and the algorithm is getting better and better at giving users what they want. But you have eliminated this underlying topology that's defined by the network, right? And so I think, in the history of the evolution of social media, the network, the social network actually was used as a shortcut to get at better recommendations back when machine learning wasn't powerful enough or evolved enough to allow algorithms to predict very accurately what users wanted.
That's
now,
very interesting. Yeah. So you've cut out the middle layer in a sense. It's jumped over it, right? It's almost like going out, getting rid of landlines and going directly to the point of contact, right?
I mean, yeah, social media companies started as a distributed peer-to-peer process of filtering of content. And I think now the tendency is more broadcasting again. Like, so TikTok, I wouldn't characterize TikTok as a peer-to-peer platform. It's more broadcasting in the sense that there's one single universe of content that the algorithm can choose from to present to the user.
So it's gone from, it was one to many, then it went from many to many, and now it's gone from one to many, but where the one is sending out variegated messages to many.
Right, and Facebook itself has evolved in that direction. In the beginning, Facebook didn't have pages or groups. Pages and groups are surfaces that were introduced in the design of the platform later on, right? And pages and groups, but mostly pages are broadcasting mechanisms, right? Pages are usually what politicians have, parties have, and so yeah, it's becoming even more complex than it was already.
Thank you.
Sure, Tian.
Thank you, Sandra. Thanks for the very interesting talk. So I have a question regarding mechanisms. You probably might know what I want to ask. So I look at the figure 2E. It's about the the distribution of a favorability score of all news domain, right? And I noticed that this figure actually have been produced for other study, for example, for the web info ecosystem. But it's so different because we all know that in the web space, actually, most mainstream news media, at least in the US, lean towards the left, right? And also from the observation of the web space, we know that the distribution of a favorability score is highly concentrated in the middle, at least from that early paper published. So I'm wondering, do you have any kind of exploration on the mechanism that account for the difference between these two info ecosystem? And the second mechanism question is, because actually, I'm very surprised to see the ideological asymmetry here. So especially, I mean, I understand that regarding misinformation, there is some kind of asymmetry that have been associated long by for example, Greenberg et al., something like that. But why there's ideological asymmetry even for the news? I'm wondering, is there any kind of mechanism testing behind that? Yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Tian. And I think I have a partial answer or an answer that's not fully satisfactory also to me, because those observations are also observations that I made at the very beginning, partly because of the research we have done together in the past. My expectation was, okay, so the distribution is going to look very different. So maybe I was expecting some skewness towards the right, but not so extreme. And the reason why my answer is be a little bit of unsatisfactory is because we only analyzed about 6 months of data after 10 years of existence or 10 plus years of existence, of Facebook's existence. And so I don't have a way of testing this. My sense, well, first of all, the mechanism is precisely the system of algorithms that determine not only the information that gets displayed on your newsfeed and kind of the feedback loop that then connects audience engagement with algorithms promoting even more that kind of content, right? So this process of amplification, algorithmic amplification. There's other research on Twitter and other platforms suggesting that algorithmic amplification benefits the right, and by the right-leaning sources. And by benefit, I mean they give more prominence and more visibility to right-leaning sources in a way that you don't have on the web, right? On the web, there's no equivalent algorithmic selection. I mean, this is search engines, but usually people who, first of all, the people who consume news on the web are a very different type of people, right? Like, so there's a subset. So people who go on the web to consume news are likely to be already high, people with high interest in politics who are motivated to go and search for news. They may use Google, but for the most part, they will go directly to the news domain. And I know you have research on pathways to news on the web, but those pathways look very different on the web precisely because of the absence of a centralized machinery of algorithmic recommendations that platforms like Facebook have, right? And so it's not only the newsfeed, it's also the algorithmic systems that shape your network, which, like people you may know, algorithms that recommend, oh, you should follow this person, or you should join this group, or why don't you follow this page, right? Those algorithmic recommendations have an impact on the network that will determine the inventory of content from which newsfeed algorithms will select. This machinery doesn't exist on the web, and this machinery operates in such a way, because of the way in which these algorithms are optimizing for engagement, that benefits outrageous content, toxicity, blah, 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 and that benefits the right more than the left. But again, I mean, a lot of this, what we are observing in this paper is the outcome of many years of operation. These algorithmic systems do not remain stationary over time either. They keep on being changed and tweaked, right? And so we are observing something that we don't know over how much time was, it's like geological forms, like we don't know over which, how much of what we observe here derives from changes in the past. And if you go to the supplementary materials, you will see that for the subset of users for whom we have platform behavior and web behavior, when you look at the distributions for web exposure to news, they look very similar to what you would expect. It's kind of bell-shaped, leaning left, but it's so I think that's consistent with our expectation. There's something unique about Facebook as a machine of information exposure that explains those figure two, essentially. But again, I mean, it's an unsatisfying answer because I can't test what I just told you. I think what we're observing is the footprint of cumulative effects over a long period of time beyond our observation window. So,
thank you, Sandra.
Sure.
Okay, any other questions? Jacob, do you have any other questions?
I was wondering if what you understand about how the people that go to social media are different than for news than the people that go to news websites like myself. The only way I can kind of understand or empathize is on it is because I was often like very cynical or really dislike pop culture when I was young. And I would always take a recommendation of a close friend about a book or a movie or a piece of music over what was in the Billboard top whatever. And because I felt like, okay, this person, like the masses, the popular masses, they don't know what's good, like pop music and stuff. But if, I wanted to, refine my sensibility. So I kind of get that like people trust people they know more from news sources. So then that makes sense that they're going to go to their Facebook feed that comes from their friends rather than this New York Times website. And that seems to correlate in the United States with the rising distrust of institutions. And this belief that these are big organizations, which of course has to do a lot with the decline of local news media, newspapers, and so on. But I'm just wondering, since you do research in this area, how you understand why there's such a large percentage of people that just get through their news from Facebook. I kind of understand it in like countries like the Philippines, where it's the only way they can get like free information. But in the United States, if people could just spend $4 a month for the New York Times, but otherwise they face the paywall. So I kind of get it. It's like a way to get free information. But what is it that really motivates people to put up such a premium on the information they get from their friends and be distrustful or not even feel like it should be a regular act of being a citizen to go to a trustworthy website and just read stuff that interests you?
Yeah, it's a combination of things. So one of my colleague, Mero Zúñiga, he has this paper, or maybe a series of papers actually, in which he talks about the news find me phenomenon. And so on social media, you don't necessarily proactively look for news. News find you through your news feed, because someone in your network will be posting those news. And then there's a mixture of identity politics, I don't know, pretending to be part of a group or actually signaling that you're part of a group, a number of reasons you may share those news that you didn't look for in the first place, but once they appear on your news feed, you share them, exposure gets magnified. And so our focus is on exposure, right? But when we look at engagement metrics, it's always a minority of people on social media, on Facebook in this case, who are producing most of the action in terms of sharing, in terms of posting, commenting. Most people on social media have a pretty passive kind of approach to news consumption. And also, you know, news content on Facebook is a minority of everything that gets posted, right? And so I think when we only use web tracking data, we are tapping only onto the minority of people who are so motivated, highly interested in politics. And so they go searching for those news. And then they are likely to become the influencers that go on social media, and then they start posting those things that they read about. And then, you know, the rippling effects go wider just because you're kind of like a captive audience on social media of your own network. And then there's all these other sociological mechanisms, or like what political science, you know, that are related to homophily, or you want to be part of a group. And so even if you don't really care about politics or Trump or whatever, or Biden, you're just going to retweet what you think your group wants you to retweet or join. So that's part of it. I think around the January 6th, you know, I mean, there were also information coordination campaigns, again, driven by a minority of highly committed individuals with very radical views. And then what social media made kind of possible is for these people to then mobilize larger numbers of people and achieve the kind of impact that they wouldn't be able to achieve otherwise. All of these dynamics, however, are driven by influencers, right? So these sort of, you don't get the same kind of influencer behavior on the web because the technology doesn't allow it. Whereas on social media, influencers have a disproportionate impact, not only on what people, you know, on what people see, but on how algorithms infer what's of interest to the public. The algorithm infers that something is of interest to the public, when in reality it's just a minority of people who are driving those trends that the algorithms pick up to kind of amplify even more. So I guess that's my answer, right? Like, so people don't go to social media to find news. News find them on social media because of the minority of influencers, or call them what you will, like the kind of the, you know, the opinion leaders that Elliot Katz, you know, talked about in his book, right? So I think that's what's happening. And all of these dynamics are always driven by a minority of users. So this is highly undemocratic in the sense that it's the minority that rules in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, any other questions from our students? Probably they're too shy, so.
Oh, don't be shy. Diane can tell you, I'm very good with with students.
So anyway,
Or
so
maybe,
probably
yeah.
I can ask some questions that on
Go
behalf
ahead.
of them. But so you just provided you just mentioned the TikTok. So you mentioned that actually the content is the same, but the based on the different algorithms, based on the algorithms, probably they will provide the information you know, personalized with to different users. So actually, probably this remind me is that probably this is related to another platform that is ChatGPT. So now that probably in the future, probably this is the most visited website, and now it's increasing as you can see that a lot of people actually are using ChatGPT to get information. So this probably will change the pattern of information consumption. So think about that as the ChatGPT, actually the content is the same. At least by training, that is the same. But when you ask the questions by different users, probably they will respond in different ways. And people, if in the future, if users is solely based on, and it's heavily based on, relied on the ChatGPT to get the news or get the information, that will be totally change the pattern. So I'm not sure that because you're the leading scholar in this field, so I'm just wondering, do you have any project on this direction or?
Not yet, but I've been thinking a lot about this because I think it will the answer to this question, how will AI, generative AI tools change the way in which we consume information, will depend a lot on the interface design for this. I mean, right now we are all familiar with the OpenAI kind of ChatGPT, like interface, or Bing, search engine now also kind of allows you to interact with the chat. But we are just like, it's been a year, really. Like, it seems like it's been a long time, but like we have a little bit more of a year since the big breakthrough. And I think in the next 1-2 years, we're going to see a lot of change in how we build interfaces on top of those engines that will determine how we consume that information, right? So if you think of Google as kind of the entry point to this universe of content called the web, Google was kind of sending people away, right? And that's how we could then track them and then see which websites they kind of people visited. That's also how the online economy operates. Advertising relies on traffic, right? Like, how do you know that you want to advertise in a given website? Well, because you have numbers of how many people visit the website, and therefore you're willing to pay more. All of that will disappear. I mean, as things currently stand, right? The way in which OpenAI, ChatGPT-like technologies operate, nothing gets sent away, right? It's like a black hole of traffic. You just chat with a bot that pulls information from the web, but retains you on the site, right? And nobody is being sent away. And of course, that's why Google went on red alert when ChatGPT was first launched, because it's like an existential threat to their business model, right? And I don't think we quite know yet, what future iterations of this technology are going to look like. What I can tell you is what we currently have is not going to stay like that forever. As it stands, though, it is true that how will we scholars be able to track what information people get exposed to when ChatGPT-like technologies are this black hole that just provide information, but they don't send people, there's no traffic. It's just you. And so it's an interesting question. To me, one thing that I was thinking would be an avenue, an entry point to understanding how these technologies are shifting how we navigate the information landscape is to look at the citations, right? So, there's been a lot of talk about how are you supposed to know that what ChatGPT tells you is legit? Well, look at the footnotes, look at the citations, right? And everybody's like, nobody reads the footnotes. How are we going to know where the information is being pulled from? But that was one design choice. Like, okay, how about we link at the, at the bottom of the answer, the kind of like we do in academic research, right? A footnote with the sources. And then that could be an avenue for us in terms of the networks of information that these machines pull from, right? It will be a way of at least getting a sense of what corner of the information universe called the web this machine is taking information from. But I mean, I think any answer I can give you right now, it's going to be meaningless in a year or so. What I do know is that, so this is just the beginning. And I know chat kind of OpenAI also has this new bot thing. I mean, you can build any interface on top of their engine, the transformer, whatever. Like but this is just beginning. And so I think the future will pretty much depend on what happens in the next year or two in terms of how inventive we are in interface design and what that interface design nudges people to do, right? Footnotes may definitely provide a foothold, absolutely. Sorry, I'm reading Eric's comment. But I mean, I'm curious, what do you have ideas?
No, I totally have no idea. I just listening your talk, and suddenly I realized that the ChatGPT probably that will change the pattern of news consumption in the future.
I mean, you know, the New York Times and other, I mean, there's also these legal issues as to whether they are appropriating copyrighted material. I don't know if you've heard about
Yeah.
this, the New York Times also, I mean, so all these things are going to change drastically. I mean, we're just at the beginning, right? And so
Yes.
nothing is going to last very long as they currently stand. I think there's going to be a lot of transformation in the next couple of years. Yeah.
Noha, you can turn on your camera to ask the question.
Yeah, so should I read it? So yeah, hi Sandra, thanks for your fascinating sharing. I'm interested in some of the differences in the results of domain level versus URL level analysis. Or what do you think of the possible explanations for the difference, and what will be the implications for future studies using weblogs, using data on domains and URLs? And that's okay if you can open the camera. So, you know, I've done research myself in the past where we only analyze domain level data. And I remember having conversations with Tian about the implications of that, right? Like, so there's things you can, the level of granularity of your data really kind of determines how deep you can go into the kind of the mechanisms and the patterns you analyze. So we've always known that that was kind of a limitation, right? Like, so by aggregating everything at the domain level, you're masking up within source variability and selection in terms of how people choose to consume news. And so during my talk, I had this terrible metaphor, but I keep on using it because I think it illustrates very powerfully what this difference between domain and URL signifies. And it's like, you know, there's a difference between going to a restaurant and accepting the menu as given, right? You're going to eat this, and this, versus going to a buffet and then you pick and choose whatever you want to eat, right? By focusing on URLs, we can really see the selection process where people really choose what news they consume based on their priors, based on their ideological propensities, not necessarily based on the branding of the news source, right? And so, you know, this matters not only because it allows people to self-select more, and we do find evidence that self-selection within sources happens, but also in terms of how we recognize legitimate sources, right? Like, so misinformation is easier to travel through the population when the branding of the source doesn't matter so much, because you don't pay attention to the cues in terms of who's behind this news story, right? Like, so you just take the news story as it is. And so it kind of dilutes the power of the brand, you know, in a way, and the power of kind of how legitimate certain kind of news sources are perceived to be, because it diffuses, right, that brand. At the same time, again, it's an empirical question. On Facebook, that figure that I showed you in my presentation, that it's actually in the supplementary materials, but the figure where we show the variability of URL level ideological scores vis-a-vis domain level ideological scores suggests that while there is some variability, which again means that people self-select news stories within the same domain. Conservatives tend to read some news stories within the New York Times. Liberals tend to read other news stories within the New York Times. In spite of this evidence of selection within domain, you know, they're pretty much, you know, I think by using the average values, we are not being too misleading, with the exception of a few news domains where, you know, you have stories that appeal conservatives only and stories that appeal liberals only. For the most part, the averages at the domain level correspond pretty well with what's happening at the URL level. But that changes from domain to domain. So, I mean, what are the implications for future research? If you can analyze URL level data, do so, because you're going to be able to see things that you wouldn't be able to see otherwise. But whether, you know, this matters more for web consumption versus Facebook consumption versus, I don't know, Weibo, I don't know, you know, it really depends on the platform per se. But I would say that that's the main kind of implication, right? Like, which is kind of dumb, right, as a conclusion, because all of us doing empirical work, I mean, we know that the more granular your data, the better. So, you know, in future research, try to get URL level data so that you would be able to see selection processes that you wouldn't be able to see otherwise.
Okay, thank you. So probably the next question, okay. also, I just wondering you if you can give some suggestion for our students or our computational social science PhD students, because I guess in the last at least 15 years that we the computational social science they used too much of us using the social media data. So the reality now that is most of the social media platforms closed the API service, so that it becomes very hard. And even for the students, for the young students, they even don't have the opportunities like you that they can collaborate with the giant companies. So do you have any suggestions for them? Any alternative data set for them?
Yeah, I mean, there's only so much I can say. I mean, yeah, and you know, I think it was bad before ChatGPT, but now that we have generative AI technologies kind of devouring information to profit from the content that other platforms or organizations have generated, it's going to become increasingly difficult to access large-scale data. Reddit doesn't share data anymore either. Like, it's not only Twitter/X or Facebook. I mean, the one thing I would say is one of the commitments of this project, this collaboration with Meta, was we have to share the data. And it's very limited data, but at least, you know, there's a repository. And I think there's a lot of questions that could be answered with that data that we didn't pre-register and didn't consider in our studies. And so we published 4. The data required for those 4 studies is already in the repository and accessible. There's 12 more studies that are coming, and the data from those studies will also be deposited. Moving forward, it's an issue, right? Like, it's an issue that we're going to have to be very inventive when it comes to data collection, experimental designs. We can't rely on publicly accessible APIs anymore. And I think that's my prediction, is that we're going to see more simulation studies where like Schelling's. I mean, you know, Schelling, he used a lot of stylized thought experiments, and computationally speaking, they weren't very sophisticated. Those were different times also. I think now we can take those thought experiments to levels of sophistication that are unprecedented, that will kind of can help us illuminate some of these notions that we've been discussing, right? Like, so bridging algorithms, how do we encode those? Well, let's run a set of simulations and see, right? So agent-based simulation is one of the very prominent tools in the toolkit of computational social science. You know, if you're interested in the real world, it's always better to try to get empirical data. In the absence of empirical data, there's still a lot of things that you can do with modeling tools, in the hopes that one day we can calibrate them empirically, or, like, you know, as I said, as sophisticated thought experiments. So that's one part of the answer. But of course, you know, we have to keep on pushing for these companies to make more data available. The Digital Services Act in Europe is intended to allow data access for researchers. Let's see what happens. You know, it's in its infancy. We need more policy efforts and regulatory efforts in that direction. But this is a collective effort thing, right? No single student, no single professor can not change in that direction on their own, right? We need some sort of coordinated effort, and in this regard, I think policymakers are quintessential. How is it? I mean, I have never, you know, I don't know. Are you seeing the same restrictions with platforms that are more prominent in Asia, like Weibo? Like, is that also, are they also restricting access to data or not, or is it becoming worse?
Even more strict. So this is a ridiculous logic, because they think that the data means money. Even they cannot make money by themselves. They still think that this is my property, so they keep it secret. That's a big problem. Anyway, Maggie, finally. Okay, this is I promise this is the last question.
Okay, yeah, that's good.
Yeah, thank you so much for this fantastic talk. I was so excited to see this collaboration with the giant social media company, and then my question is, it actually reminds me a lot of data science work or A/B testing work done inside the company itself. So I know that they must have also recruited a lot of data science people working on projects like that. So I was wondering, for those types of social science research, how do researchers position themselves in more science-oriented instead of more company driven or like a company PR strategy sort of things.
I mean, that's the danger, right? Like, so one of the sine qua nons for this specific project that we academics put on the table is the conflict of interest, right? Like, so if you're an employee for these companies, if these companies pay you a salary or consulting fees or your internship, they own you, literally. Like, they own your ideas and the work that you do. And then you have to sign all sorts of non-disclosure agreements. And this is the reason why there's so many whistleblowers that are kind of leaking reports and documents and internal A/B testing done in these corporations. And, you know, the Francis Hogan kind of scandal, right, in the US, a lot of the research that is done internally doesn't come out publicly because of this control that these companies have on the intellectual work that the researchers do. When we started this project, we wanted to make sure that that we academics remain independent. And of course, the meaning of independent here, there was this one piece that came out when we published titled Independence by Permission. Yes, we could do this research with Meta because they agreed to collaborate with external academics. So in that regard, we were independent by permission, because hadn't they given us access to the data, this project and these papers wouldn't exist. However, once they agreed that they wanted to let us access the data, there were a number of conditions that we put on the table, including independence, intellectually speaking, as in you cannot forbid us from publishing these results. Like, we have pre-registered studies where we tell you what we need in order to answer these questions that we've chosen independently. And if you don't give us access to this data, then the collaboration is broken. So that's how we did it. That's what Social Science One, which is kind of the first step in this direction in terms of academia industry collaboration, intended to do, right? So it's like a contract where you say, okay, we're going to offer this external assessment of what happened on the platform, but in return, you have to let us do it independently. And by that we mean that, you know, that we have the last word in terms of how do we interpret the data, how we analyze it, and what we say about the data. And so again, if you go through the supplementary materials in all these 4 papers that have been published, you'll see what the kind of the terms of the collaboration were. And so moving forward, we hope that this is a good model to facilitate this kind of collaboration between academics and industry that gives legitimacy to the work done by academics, because it comes out of a social contract of sorts where there's a lot of provisions intended to guarantee the integrity of the research. So that's how we did it. You can look at the supplementary materials. None of us were paid to be part of this work. All of us worked extra hours because we had to keep on doing our jobs. You know, we accepted no money, nothing. There's been pushback, right? Like, so, you know, after publishing, a lot of people think that in spite of all these measures, we're still not independent, because we are like, some people have chosen to interpret these as we are a part of the PR department of Facebook, and all these papers are just part of their PR campaign. As someone who has been involved in the nitty-gritty details of this research, and I've done risk analysis myself, and I've looked at the data myself, I can guarantee you that that's a conspiratorial understanding of what this collaboration entails, right? And there's conspiratorial thinking in academia too. Is it perfect, this model of collaboration? Probably not. You know, like, if we had a policy or regulatory framework that forces companies to hand over data to researchers like us, that would be better. We don't have that yet. And so the way we thought about this collaboration is it better to know something or to keep on not knowing anything? We chose, let's get access to the data, knowing that this model of collaboration is probably not the last word or the perfect model moving forward, but it's one step in the right direction. And so if you're thinking about kind of creating some sort of similar collaboration with other companies, I think we provide a good model as a starting point of how to think about doing so in a way that protects the integrity of the research and you're independent as a researcher. But it is true that to the extent that this is proprietary data, every time we need their permission to analyze the data, we are not 100% independent. We still need these companies to give us access to the data because there's no mandate that forces them to give access to the data. So in that regard, they still have the power, right? And so in that sense, it's not ideal. And the last thing I would say, having said that, I personally have never been paid by these companies. I would never accept I would never sign a contract with them because I think one of the most prized kind of precious things that I have as a scholar in a university is my independence, right? So, but some of my colleagues have worked with them. Some of my students want to go for internships, and I also think that's fine. Like, I mean, either way. I mean, I don't think there's one way of doing things, right? And so if you have the chance of doing a paid internship or a paid fellowship, or like, go ahead if you think that's right for you, you know, like there's many different ways in which you can make an impact. But conflict of interest is an issue. And so I think you have to be mindful of that. So if you get paid by these companies, that's a conflict of interest. So you have to be mindful of that.
Yeah, thank you so much for the answer.
Okay, as I just promised, this is the last question. Okay, so thank you very much, Sandra. Thank you again for joining us. Give a very, very important and fantastic talk, and also to answer our questions. So I hope that we will have an opportunity to invite you to Hong Kong in the future, and also hope to see you soon offline. Okay.
Thank you. It's been a
Thank
pleasure.
you. And also the audience, thank you all for coming for today's talk. So hope to see you again. Okay. So
Bye.
Sandra, yeah, thank you.
Bye.